Hello everyone! I hope you're ready for another adventure, because Wayne continues to read Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. Always remember that if you like to follow along with our adventures here on the channel, all you have to do is press the CC button in your YouTube link to be able to practice reading and following along with the words. I wonder who's going to join us for today's adventure. Oh wow! Madam Owl is going to join us. We haven't seen you since our Halloween specials. Madam Owl loves reading, so obviously this will be the perfect book for Madam Owl to join us with. Are you ready for this adventure, Madam Owl? Awesome. Madam Owl's ready. Let's jump in. Chapter 2, The Vanishing Glass. Nearly 10 years had passed since the Dursley had woken up to find their nephew on the front step, but Privet Jive had hardly changed at all. The sun rose on the same tidy front gardens and lit up the brass number 4 on the Dursleys' front door. It crept into their living room, which was almost entirely the same as it had been on the night when Mr. Dursley had seen that fateful news report about the owls. Only the photographs on the mantel really showed how much time had passed. 10 years ago, there had been lots of pictures of what looked like a pink beach ball wearing different colored bonnets. But Dudley Dursley was no longer a baby, and now the photograph showed a large blonde boy riding his first bicycle, on the carousel at the fair, playing a computer game with his father, being hugged and kissed by his mother. The room held no sign at all of another boy that lived in the house too. Yet Harry Potter was still there, asleep at the moment, but not for long. His Aunt Petunia was awake, and it was her shrill voice that made his first noise of the day. Up! Get up now! Harry woke up with a start. His aunt rapped the door again. Up! She screeched. Harry heard her walking towards the kitchen, and then the sound of the frying pan being put on the stove. He rolled onto his back and tried to remember the dream he was having. It was another good one. There had been a flying motorcycle in it. He had a funny feeling he had the same dream before. His aunt was back outside the door. Are you up yet? She demanded. Nearly, said Harry. Well, get a move on. I want you to look after the bacon, and don't you dare let it burn. I want everything perfect for Dudley's birthday. Harry groaned. What did you say? His aunt snapped through the door. Nothing. Dudley's birthday. How could I have forgotten? Harry got out of bed and started looking for his socks. He found a pair under the bed. Pulling a spider off of them, he put them on. Harry was used to spiders, because the cupboard under the stairs was full of them, and that was where he slept. When he was dressed, he went down the hall to the kitchen. The table was almost hidden beneath all of Dudley's presents. It looked as though Dudley had gotten a new computer he wanted, not to mention a second television and a racing bike. Exactly why Dudley wanted a racing bike was a mystery to Harry, as Dudley was very fat and hated exercise, unless, of course, it involved punching somebody. Dudley's favorite punching bag was Harry, but he couldn't often catch him. Harry didn't look it, but he was very fast. Perhaps it had something to do with living in a dark cupboard, but Harry had always been small and skinny for his age. He looked even smaller and skinnier than he really was, because all he had to wear were Dudley's old clothes, and Dudley was about 4 times bigger than he was. Harry had a thin face, knobby knees, black hair, and bright green eyes. He wore round glasses held together by a lot of scotch tape because of all the times Dudley had punched him in the nose. The only thing Harry liked about his own appearance was a very thin scar on his forehead that was shaped like a bolt of lightning. He had it as long as he could remember, and the first question he could ever remember asking his Aunt Petunia was how he had gotten it. In the car crash when your parents died, she said, and don't ask questions. Don't ask questions. That was the first rule for a quiet life with the Dursleys. Uncle Vernon entered the kitchen as Harry was turning over the bacon. "Comb your hair," he barked, by halfway of the morning greeting. About once a week, Uncle Vernon looked over the top of his newspaper and shouted at Harry that Harry needed a haircut. Harry must have needed more haircuts than the rest of all the boys in class put together. But it made no difference. His hair simply grew that way, all over the place. Harry was frying eggs by the time Dudley arrived in the kitchen with his mother. Dudley looked a lot like Uncle Vernon. He had a large pink face, not much neck, small watery blue eyes, and thick blonde hair that lay smoothly on his thick, fat head. Aunt Petunia often said that Dudley looked like a baby angel. Harry often said he looked like a pig in a wig. Harry put the plates of eggs and bacon on the table, which was difficult as there wasn't much room. Dudley, meanwhile, was counting his presents. His face fell. 36? He said, looking up at his mother and father. That's 2 less than last year. Darling, you haven't counted Aunt Margie's present. See? It's here under the big one from Mommy and Daddy. All right, 37 then, said Dudley, going in red face. Harry, who could see a huge Dudley tantrum coming on, began wolfing down his bacon as fast as he possibly could, in case Dudley turned the table over. Aunt Petunia obviously sensed danger too, because she said quickly, "And we'll buy you another 2 presents while we're out today. How's that, Popkin?" 2 more presents? Is that all right? Dudley thought about it for a moment. It looked like a hard work. Finally, he said slowly, "I'll have 39, sweetums," said Aunt Petunia. "Oh!" Dudley sat down heavily and grabbed the first parcel. "All right, then." Uncle Vernon chuckled. "Little Tyke really wants his money's worth, just like his father. Attaboy, Dudley." He rubbed Dudley's hair. At that moment, the telephone rang, and Aunt Petunia went to answer it while Harry and Uncle Vernon watched Dudley unwrap the racing bike, video camera, remote control airplane, 16 new computer games, and a VCR. He was ripping the paper off of a gold wristwatch when Aunt Petunia came back from the telephone looking both angry and worried. "Bad news, Vernon," she said. "Mrs. Figg's broken her leg. She can't take him." She jerked over in Harry's direction. Dudley's mouth fell open in horror, but Harry's heart gave a leap. Every year, on Dudley's birthday, his parents took him and a friend out for the day, to adventure parks, hamburger restaurants, or the movies. Every year, Harry was left with Miss Figg, a mad old lady who lived 2 streets away. Harry hated it there. The whole house smelled of cabbage, and Mrs. Figg made him look at photographs of all the cats she ever owned. "Now what?" said Aunt Petunia, looking furiously at Harry, as though he'd planned this. Harry knew he ought to feel sorry that Mrs. Figg had broken her leg, but it was easy when he reminded himself that he'd have to go a whole year before he had to look at Tibbles, Snowy, Mr. Paws, and Tuffy again. "We could phone Marge," Uncle Vernon said. "Don't be silly, Vernon. She hates the boy." The Dursleys often spoke about Harry like this, as though he wasn't there, or rather, as though he was something very nasty that couldn't understand them, like a slug. "What about what's-her-name, your friend, Yvonne?" "On vacation in Majorca," snapped Aunt Petunia. "You could just leave me here," Harry said hopefully. He'd be able to watch what he wanted on television for a change, and maybe even go on Dudley's computer. Aunt Petunia had looked though as she just swallowed a lemon. "And come back to find the house in ruins?" she snarled. "I won't blow the house up," Harry said. But they weren't listening. "I suppose we could take him to the zoo," said Aunt Petunia slowly, "and leave him in the car. The car's new. He's not sitting in there alone." Dudley began to cry. In fact, he wasn't really crying. It had been years since he'd really cried. But he knew if he made a screwed-up face and wailed, his mother would give him anything he wanted. "Dudley, Dinky Dudley-Dums, don't cry. Mommy won't let him spoil your special day," she cried, flinging his arms around him. "I don't want him to come," Dudley said, between huge pretend sobs. "He always spoils everything." He shot Harry a nasty grin through the gap in his mother's arms. Just then the doorbell rang. "Oh, good Lord, they're here," said Aunt Petunia frankly. And a moment later, Dudley's best friend, Piers Polkiss, walked in with his mother. Piers was a scrawny boy with a face like a rat. He was usually the one who held people's arms behind their back when Dudley hit them. Dudley stopped pretending to cry at once. Half an hour later, Harry couldn't believe his luck, sitting in the back of the Dursleys' car with Piers and Dudley, on the way to the zoo for the first time in his life. His aunt and uncle hadn't been able to think of anything else to do with him, but before they left, Uncle Vernon took Harry aside. "I'm warning you," he said, putting his purple face right up close to Harry's. "I'm warning you now, boy. Any funny business, anything at all, and you'll be in the cupboard from now until Christmas." "I'm not going to do anything," Harry said, "honestly." But Uncle Vernon didn't believe him. No one ever did. The problem was, strange things often happened to Harry, and it was just no good telling the Dursleys he didn't make them happen. Once, Aunt Petunia, tired of Harry coming back from the barber looking as though he hadn't been at all, had taken a pair of kitchen scissors and cut his hair so short he was almost bald except for bangs, which she'd left to hide that terrible scar. Dudley had laughed himself silly at Harry, who spent a sleepless night imagining school the next day, where he'd already laughed at with his baggy clothes and taped glasses. Next morning, however, he had gotten up to find that his hair was exactly how it was before. Aunt Petunia had sheared it off and had given him a week in the cupboard for this. Even though he had tried to explain that, he couldn't help explain how it grown back so quickly. Another time, Aunt Petunia was trying to force him into a revolting old sweater of Dudley's. The harder she tried to pull it over her head, the smaller it seemed to become, until, finally, it might have fit a hand puppet, but certainly wouldn't fit Harry. Aunt Petunia had decided it must have shrunken in the wash, and, to his great relief, Harry wasn't punished. On the other hand, he'd gotten into terrible trouble for being found on the roof of the school kitchens. Dudley's gang had been chasing him around as usual, as much as Harry's surprise as anyone else's. There he was sitting on the chimney. The Dursleys had received an angry letter from Harry's headmistress, telling them Harry had been climbing school buildings. But all he'd tried to do was, as he shouted at Uncle Vernon through the locked door of his cupboard, was jump behind the big trash can outside of the kitchen doors. Harry supposed that the wind must have caught him in a mid-jump. But today, nothing was going to go wrong. It was even worth being with Dudley and Piers to be spending the day somewhere that wasn't school, his cupboard, or Mrs. Figg's cabbage-smelling living room. While he drove, Uncle Vernon complained to Aunt Petunia. He liked to complain about things. People at work, Harry, the council, Harry, the bank, Harry were just a few of his favorite subjects. This morning it was motorcycles. "Roaring along like maniacs, the young hoodlums," he said, as a motorcycle overtook them. "I had a dream about a motorcycle," Harry said, remembering sadly. "It was flying." Uncle Vernon nearly crashed the car. He turned right around in his seat and yelled Harry right in his face, like a gigantic beat with a mustache. "Motorcycles don't fly." Dudley and Piers snickered. "I know they don't," said Harry. "It was only a dream." But he wished he hadn't said anything. If there was one thing the Dursleys hated even more than his asking questions, it was his talking about anything acting in a way it shouldn't, no matter if it was a dream or even a cartoon. They seemed to think he might get dangerous ideas. It was a very sunny Saturday, and the zoo was crowded with families. The Dursleys bought Dudley and Piers large chocolate ice creams at the entrance, and then, because the smiling lady in the van had asked Harry what he wanted before they could hurry him away, they bought him a cheap lemon ice pop. It wasn't bad either, Harry thought, licking it as they watched a gorilla scratching his head, who looked remarkably like Dudley, except it wasn't blonde. Harry had the best morning he had in a long time. He was careful to walk a little way apart from the Dursleys so that Dudley and Piers, who were starting to get bored, of the animals by lunchtime wouldn't fall back on their favorite hobby of hitting him. They ate in the zoo restaurant, and when Dudley had a tantrum because the Knickerbocker Glory didn't have enough ice cream on top, Uncle Vernon brought him another one, and Harry was allowed to finish the first. Harry felt afterwards that she should have known it was all too good to last. After lunch, they had went to the reptile house. It was cool and dark in there, with lit windows all along the walls. Behind the glass, all sorts of lizards and snakes were crawling and slithering over bits of wood and stone. Dudley and Piers wanted to see huge poisonous cobras and thick, man-crushing pythons. Dudley quickly found the largest snake in the place. It would have wrapped its body twice around Uncle Vernon's car and crushed it into a toucan. But at that moment, it didn't look like it was in the mood. In fact, it was asleep. Dudley stood there with his nose pressed against the glass, staring at the glistening brown coils. "Make it move," he whined to his father. Uncle Vernon tapped on the glass, but the snake didn't budge. "Do it again," Dudley ordered. Uncle Vernon rapped on the glass, smartly with his knuckles, but the snake just snoozed on. "This is boring," Dudley moaned. He shuffled away. Harry moved in front of the tank and looked intently at the snake. He would have been surprising if it had died of boredom itself. No company, except stupid people drumming their fingers on the glass, trying to disturb it all day. It was worse than having being in a cupboard as a bedroom, where the only visitor was Aunt Petunia hammering on the door to wake you up. At least he got to visit the rest of the house. The snake suddenly opened its beady eyes. Slowly, very slowly, it raised its head until it was eye level with Harry. It winked. The snake jerked its head toward Uncle Vernon and Dudley, then raised its eyes to the ceiling. It gave Harry a look that said plainly, "I get that all the time." "I know," Harry murmured through the glass, though he wasn't sure the snake could hear him. It must be really annoying. The snake nodded vigorously. "Where do you guys come from, anyway?" Harry asked. The snake jabbed its tail at a little sign next to the glass. Harry peered at it. "Boa constrictor, Brazil." "Was it nice there?" The constrictor jabbed its tail at the sign again, and Harry read on. "This specimen was bred in the zoo." "Oh, I see. So you've never been to Brazil?" As the snake shook its head, a deafening sound behind Harry made the both of them jump. "Dudley! Mr. Dursley! Come and look, it's the snake! You won't believe it, what it's doing!" Dudley came waddling toward them as fast as he could. "Out of the way, you," he said, punching Harry in the ribs. Caught by surprise, Harry fell hard to the concrete floor. What came next happened so fast, he had no way to see what had happened. 1 second, Piers and Dursley were leading up to the glass. The next, they had leapt back with horrors. Harry sat up and gasped. The glass in front of the boa constrictor's tank had vanished. The snake there was uncoiling itself rapidly, slithering out onto the floor. People throughout the reptile house screamed and started running for the exit. As the snake slid swiftly past him, Harry could have sworn a low hissing voice said, "Brazil, here I come. Thanks, amigo." The keeper of the reptile house was in shock. "But the glass," he kept saying. "Where did the glass go?" The zoo director himself made Aunt Petunia a strong cup of sweet tea while he apologized over and over again. Piers and Dudley could only gibber. As far as Harry had seen, the snake hadn't done anything except snap playfully at their heels as it passed. But by the time they were called all the way back to Uncle Vernon's car, Dudley was telling him how it had nearly bitten his leg off. But by the time they were all back in Uncle Vernon's car, Dudley was telling him how it had nearly bitten off his leg, while Piers was swearing it had tried to squeeze him to death. But worst of all, for Harry at least, was Piers calming down enough saying, "Harry was talking to it. Weren't you, Harry?" Uncle Vernon waited until Piers was safely out of the house before starting on Harry. He was so angry that he could hardly speak. He managed to say, "Go, cupboard, stay, no meals." before he collapsed into a chair and Aunt Petunia had run to get him a large brandy. Harry lay in the dark cupboard much later, wishing he had a watch. He didn't know what time it was, and he couldn't be sure the Dursleys were asleep yet. Until they were, he couldn't risk sneaking into the kitchen for food. He'd lived with the Dursleys almost 10 years. 10 miserable years. As long as he could remember, ever since he'd been a baby and his parents had died in a car crash. He couldn't remember being in the car when his parents had died. Sometimes, when he'd strained his memory during the long hours in his cupboard, he came up with a strange vision, a blinding flash of green light, and a burning pain in his forehead. This, he supposed, was the crash, though he couldn't imagine where all the green light came from. He couldn't remember his parents at all. His aunt and uncle never spoke about them, and of course he was forbidden to ask questions. There were no photographs of them in the house. When he had been younger, Harry had dreamed and dreamed of some unknown relation coming to take him away, but it had never happened. The Dursleys were his only family, yet sometimes he thought, or maybe hoped, that strangers in the street seemed to know him. Very strange strangers they were too. A tiny man in a violet top hat had bowed to him once while they were out shopping with Aunt Petunia and Dudley. After asking Harry furiously if he knew the man, Aunt Petunia had rushed them out of the shop without buying anything. A wild-looking old woman, dressed in all green, had waved merrily at him on the bus. A bald man in a very long purple coat had actually shaken his hand in the street the other day and then walked away without the word. The weirdest thing about all of these people was the way they seemed to vanish the second Harry tried to get a second look. At school, Harry had no one. Everyone knew that Dudley's gang hated that odd Harry Potter in his baggy old clothes and broken glasses, and no one liked to disagree with Dudley's gang. Wow, there's a lot going on in this adventure. What do you think about Chapter 2, Madam Owl? I agree. But hopefully you'll be back for another part of this adventure. See you soon. And we'll see you on the next time here with Wayne Reads. Thank you for joining along. We can't wait to see you on the next adventure. Bye-bye.